It was a cold night in the winter of 1930 when I first heard the tales about the phantom train of Pennsylvania. At the time, I was just a young engineer, having been on the Pennsylvania Railroad, PRR, for less than a year. I was still learning the ropes under the watchful eyes of veterans like Tom Richards, a man whose face was weathered from years of operating the great machines that had been the lifeblood of our nation's railroads. The year was 1930, but the rumors of this cursed train, whispered among the older crew members, stretched far back into the late 1800s. I had heard of the ghost stories before, the kind that old men tell to pass the time or to frighten the greenhorns, but this one was different. It wasn't some vague tale about restless spirits. This was something people claimed to have seen, something that followed a pattern, something real. There was a train, they said, that ran along the old tracks that wound through the Allegheny Mountains, near a place called Altoona, Pennsylvania. And that train? Well, it was said to carry the souls of those who had perished in tragic accidents. People who had never left the tracks, trapped in a place where the living and the dead could not meet. The train itself wasn't ordinary, not by any means. It wasn't listed on the schedules, not a part of any known route. It would appear without warning, often late at night or in the early hours of the morning when the air was thick with fog, and the world was quiet except for the sounds of the rails. I met some of the men who had worked on the trains during that time, the ones who had seen the phantom train with their own eyes. They told me the most peculiar things. Tom Richards, a tall, burly man with deep-set eyes that always seemed to be staring into the distance, was the first to mention it. We were sitting around the fire in the station house, sipping on warm coffee to stave off the chill of the night, when he told me the first piece of the legend. "You ever hear of the phantom train, Johnny?" he asked, his voice low and rough, like he'd been talking about it for too long. I shook my head. At the time, I thought it was just another old man's tall tale. But his eyes were serious, and that alone made me listen. "It was back in the summer of 1888, he said. "Before your time, before anyone alive today, really. The train was making a regular run through the mountains. They say a storm rolled in, fast and sudden. No one knew it at the time, but that storm brought something with it. That's when the first man saw it." I remember how he paused, letting the silence stretch out before continuing. "It was the engineer, a man by the name of Samuel Woods. The train was heading toward Altoona, on the tracks that cut through the heart of the mountains. All of a sudden, Samuel saw another train coming from the opposite direction. But there was something wrong about it. The train's lights were dim, the smoke it emitted was thick and black, and there was no sound, just the steady rumble of the tracks beneath him." He took another sip of his coffee before adding, "He tried to wave the other train off, but it didn't respond. It was like it was headed straight for him. And when it passed by, he saw the passengers, their faces pale as death. Their eyes, well, they say they were hollow, empty." "Did it crash?" I asked, feeling a chill creep down my spine. Tom shook his head slowly. "No. The train just vanished into thin air like smoke." "And Samuel Woods?" "He never spoke of it again. But after that night, the strange sightings started. It wasn't just Samuel either. Other crews reported it. The phantom train would appear, sometimes on the same tracks, sometimes further off. It became a curse. And after a while, no one was willing to speak about it openly. This was the beginning of the story. I would learn much more as time went on. Strange sightings, inexplicable disappearances, and tales of restless spirits. The history of the phantom train is tied to the very soul of the Pennsylvania Railroad itself, a shadow hanging over the tracks and its workers. But more than anything, I would learn that the train wasn't just a tale. It was a warning. The tales I heard in the station house weren't just rumors. There was a nervous energy among the older men, something that made them reluctant to speak too openly about the phantom train. 4 weeks, I worked alongside Tom Richards and other seasoned engineers, learning the ins and outs of running the heavy locomotives, mastering the intricacies of the tracks that carved through the Allegheny Mountains. But I noticed something strange in the way the older men spoke, or rather didn't speak. They would go quiet whenever the topic of the phantom train came up, their faces hardening as though the subject itself was something they dared not address. One afternoon in early December, I was assigned to work a night shift, taking an old Pennsylvania Railroad steam engine on the route through Altoona, across the famous Horseshoe Curve, and down to the next station in Gallatin. It was a relatively short run, nothing out of the ordinary. The weather was cold and a low mist had settled over the mountains, making the darkness feel heavier than usual. Before I left, I had a brief exchange with Richard Hall, a man whose age seemed to have caught up with him faster than most of the others. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his coat, the scars of his years of service etched into his skin. His voice trembled when he spoke. "You sure you're ready, Johnny?" he asked, glancing around as if to make sure no one else could hear. I smiled, eager to prove myself, but there was a hesitation in his eyes that made me second-guess the confidence in my voice. "Of course, Mr. Hall. I've been trained. What's the worst that could happen?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at me, his gaze deepening before his voice dropped to a whisper. "You'll be fine, son, just don't go near the old tracks near tunnel number 2. That's where it happens. Don't look for it. Don't even think about it." I nodded, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. "Tunnel number 2? What do you mean?" But Richard Hall was already walking away, his footsteps slow and deliberate. "You'll see. Just don't go looking for it." His words stayed with me as I boarded the engine that night, the great locomotive rumbling to life beneath me. As the train made its way through the mountains, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that the old man's warning was more than just the ramblings of an overworked mind. There was something about the night, something in the air, that felt off. We passed the first few miles without incident, the tracks winding through the dense forest, the train's headlamps slicing through the fog like a blade. It wasn't until we reached the vicinity of tunnel number 2 that things began to feel different. The night had grown darker, the fog thicker, and I had the distinct sensation that something was watching us. The train's whistle echoed through the hollow, reverberating off the mountains, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in the distance. A dark shadow moving at an unnatural speed. I blinked and it was gone. But the unease settled in deeper. As we approached tunnel number 2, I couldn't help but remember Richard Hall's warning. My hands tightened on the controls as the tunnel loomed ahead, its entrance a gaping maw in the side of the mountain. We had to slow down as we entered, the sound of the wheels against the track growing louder in the confined space. But as we passed through, something strange happened. There, in the dim light of my lantern, I saw it, an indistinct form standing just outside the tunnel's exit. It was a figure, a shadow, tall and thin, but too blurry to make out any details. For a moment, I thought it was just the fog playing tricks on my eyes. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of a train that shouldn't have been there. It was coming from the opposite direction, and the sound was growing louder by the second. My heart skipped a beat. It was impossible. There was no scheduled train for hours, and I had checked the tracks earlier that night. There was no way anyone else was on this line. I hit the whistle, signaling a warning. But the figure didn't move, and the sound of the train grew closer. I slammed my hand down on the brakes, but it was too late. The train, no, the phantom train, passed us on the tracks. It was a shadow, dark as midnight, with no light, no smoke, just the sound of the wheels scraping against the rails. There were no passengers visible, but the faintest wisp of a cold wind swept through the cab as the train passed by, like the breath of something long dead. And just like that, it vanished. I sat there, my heart racing, trying to process what had just happened. My hands were trembling and sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cold. But I knew one thing for sure now, the stories were real. This wasn't just some ghost story to scare the young ones. The phantom train existed, and it was waiting for the next to cross its path. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I had always been a practical man, grounded in reality and the rhythms of the tracks. But what I experienced that evening at tunnel number 2 was beyond anything I could explain. The image of the phantom train passing us, silent, dark, and cold, lingered in my mind long after I had returned to the station. The crew, as usual, didn't speak of it. But the old men exchanged glances, knowing looks, that told me everything I needed to know. They had seen it too. I didn't tell anyone about what I had seen. In truth, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Maybe it had been a trick of the fog, a figment of my imagination born from exhaustion. But as I climbed into the engine the following night, that uneasy feeling stuck with me like a weight. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that the train wasn't finished with me. The next few days passed uneventfully, but I noticed something strange happening in the station. Other engineers, men I had worked with before without incident, started looking at me differently. They weren't as talkative, their usual chatter replaced by quiet nods and distant glances. I caught whispers in the hallways, mutterings about something that I couldn't quite hear, but I knew what they were talking about. The phantom train. Tom Richards, who had first told me about the train, pulled me aside one evening, his face pale under the station's dim lights. He looked around nervously before speaking. "You've seen it, haven't you, Johnny?" he asked quietly, his voice strained. "The train. The one that doesn't belong." I nodded slowly, the image of that spectral locomotive still fresh in my mind. "You're not the only one, kid," Tom continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen it too. More than once. But there's something about the train that's worse than just the ghost of it. It's the eyes of the passengers. I'll never forget those eyes." I felt a chill run down my spine. "The eyes." Tom leaned closer, his breath heavy. "I don't know how to explain it, but every time you see the phantom train you can feel them, those eyes on you. They're hollow, dark, and they follow you wherever you go. Like they can see inside you." I shook my head, the words unsettling me in ways I couldn't quite express. "What do you mean, Tom?" "Eyes. What do you mean by that?" He shuddered, the words slow and deliberate as though they were hard to pull from his throat. "Do you remember that night in 1888 when Samuel Wood saw it? That first engineer to spot the phantom train? He said the same thing, those eyes were everywhere. Not just on the train but in the woods, in the tunnels. Watching. Waiting." I felt a cold dread creeping up on me, something I couldn't escape. I had dismissed the idea of supernatural forces on the tracks, but now I wasn't so sure. There were too many coincidences, too many whispered warnings. The idea that this train wasn't just a ghost, but something more, something that followed you, felt like a knot in my chest. That night, I was assigned to run the same route through the mountains again. The weather was eerily calm, but the fog was thick, and it seemed like the air itself was holding its breath. As I made my way toward tunnel number 2 once more, my nerves were on edge. I kept glancing at the track ahead, half expecting the shadow of that phantom train to appear again, but nothing happened. I passed through tunnel number 2 with little incident, the train's headlights cutting through the dense fog. But as I emerged from the tunnel, I saw something, a figure far in the distance, standing by the tracks just as I had seen it before. I froze. It wasn't the phantom train. It wasn't anything that belonged to this world. The figure was tall like a man, but its proportions were off, wrong. Its limbs were elongated, its posture too straight, too rigid, and it was standing motionless, its head turned toward me as though it had been waiting. But it was its eyes that grabbed my attention. Even from this distance I could see them, dark, hollow pits, empty and endless, staring into me. It was the same sensation Tom Richards had warned me about. I could feel it, those eyes drawing me in, pulling at my soul like an invisible force. And then, without warning, it vanished just like the train had. I didn't stop the train. I couldn't. Something in my gut told me that if I did, if I let the train slow down, I would be trapped. In that moment, I understood what the older engineers had feared. There was a reason they never spoke about it directly. The phantom train wasn't just a ghost, but a part of something larger, something that bled into this world from the other side. When I reached the next station, my hands were shaking. I didn't even want to look back at the track I had just traveled, for fear that I would see that figure again. But I knew it wouldn't matter. The phantom train, its eyes, would follow me wherever I went. I realized then that I was no longer just a witness to this mystery. I was a part of it. I didn't sleep that night after the encounter near tunnel number 2. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure, its distorted silhouette, its hollow eyes unblinking and endless. It was as if the memory had etched itself into my mind, refusing to fade. Even when I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the fog, some play of light and shadow, the cold, creeping fear in my chest told me otherwise. The next morning, as I sat in the station house, sipping a mug of weak coffee, Tom Richards approached me. He didn't speak right away, but his expression said everything. He knew. Somehow, without a word, he knew what I'd seen. "You saw them, didn't you?" he asked quietly, sitting down across from me. I hesitated, then nodded. I don't know what it was, but it felt wrong. Like it wasn't supposed to be there. And those eyes, Tom, God, those eyes. He let out a long sigh and looked down at his hands. They're not just eyes, Johnny. There's something worse. Something that stays with you. You can't unsee them. Once you've looked into them, it's like they've marked you. Marked me? I repeated, my voice shaking. What does that even mean? Tom leaned closer, lowering his voice as if the walls themselves might be listening. The phantom train doesn't just appear to anyone. It picks people. Those it shows itself to, they're part of its story now. Part of the curse. I stared at him, trying to process his words. Why? Why would it pick me? I didn't do anything. He shook his head. No one knows. Some say it's the spirits of those who died on the tracks looking for company. Others think it's something older, something tied to the land itself. But once it's chosen you, there's no going back. The train will come for you again, Johnny. And next time it won't just pass you by. I felt a chill run down my spine. What do I do? How do I stop it? Tom's face grew darker, the lines around his mouth deepening. You can't stop it. The best you can do is avoid the old lines, stay away from the places where it's been seen. But even that might not be enough. It's like a shadow, kid. No matter how fast you run, it's always just a step behind. His words haunted me as I went about my duties that day. The routine tasks of an engineer, once comforting in their familiarity, now felt heavy with dread. Every whistle of the train, every creak of the tracks, seemed like a whisper of the phantom train, reminding me that it was still out there, waiting. That night, I decided to dig deeper. If this train was real, if it truly was tied to the deaths and tragedies on the tracks, then there had to be a history, a reason for its existence. I spent hours in the station's archives, combing through old records and newspaper clippings. What I found chilled me to my core. The first recorded sighting of the phantom train dated back to 1877, just a year after a catastrophic derailment on the Altoona line. The accident, caused by a faulty brake system, had sent a passenger train careening off the tracks and into a ravine. Over 50 people died that night, their bodies mangled and burned beyond recognition. Many of them were never identified, their remains buried in unmarked graves near the site of the crash. But that wasn't the only tragedy. Over the years, the Altoona line had become infamous for its accidents, collisions, derailments, even unexplained disappearances. And every time there were reports of strange sightings, shadowy figures near the tracks, ghostly lights flickering in the distance, and of course the phantom train itself. One account, written by an anonymous railroad worker in 1892, described an encounter eerily similar to mine. It came in the dead of night, the worker wrote, a train of shadows, silent as the grave. The passengers stared out from the windows, their faces pale and lifeless, their eyes empty. When it passed, the air grew cold, and I felt as though my soul had been laid bare. I couldn't shake the feeling that the train was connected to these tragedies, that it was some kind of echo, a residual force tied to the pain and death that had stained the tracks. But there was one detail that stood out above all the others. The sightings always happened in the same places. Tunnel number 2, the Horseshoe Curve, the abandoned switchyard near Gallatin. These were places where the veil between the living and the dead seemed thin, where the echoes of the past lingered like shadows on the tracks. As I closed the last dusty record, the clock in the station struck midnight. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the wind outside. But as I stood to leave, I felt it again, that oppressive, suffocating presence, like a weight pressing down on my chest. And then, faintly, I heard it, the distant sound of a train whistle. It wasn't from the yard. It wasn't from any of the scheduled routes. It was coming from the mountains, from tunnel number 2. The sound of the train whistle echoed in my ears long after it faded. It wasn't like any whistle I'd heard before. It was mournful, hollow, as if calling out from a place where time and life no longer mattered. My hands shook as I gathered my things from the archive room, the distant sound refusing to leave my mind. I tried to convince myself it was just a regular train, some unscheduled movement in the yard or along another line. But deep down I knew better. There was no mistaking that whistle. It wasn't of this world. It belonged to it, the phantom train. The next day, I was assigned a freight run to Pittsburgh, a longer route that I thought might give me some distance from the haunting specter of Tunnel Number 2. I told myself that if I stayed focused, I could outrun the shadow of the train. But shadows, as Tom Richards had warned, have a way of following you. The run to Pittsburgh. The evening started like any other. I boarded the engine, my usual routine giving me a sense of control, however fleeting. My fireman that night was a young man named Henry Collins, a bright-eyed rookie who had just started with the Pennsylvania Railroad. His enthusiasm reminded me of myself when I first began, before the stories and sightings had drained the excitement from my veins. "You ever hear about the Phantom train?" he asked suddenly as we were checking the engine's pressure gauges. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced at him, trying to gauge whether he was joking, but his expression was earnest. "Why do you ask?" I said cautiously. Henry shrugged, shoveling coal into the firebox. "Just something I heard in the yard. Some of the older guys were talking about it. Said it's been seen around here. Thought it might be a good ghost story for the ride." I forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow even to me. "Don't believe everything you hear. Old men like to tell tales to keep rookies like you on edge." He grinned, but I could see a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Guess that means you don't believe in it, huh?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. The first leg of the journey was uneventful, the train cutting through the rolling hills and dense forests of western Pennsylvania. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the rails was a comfort, a steady reminder of the tangible world around me. But as the night deepened and the fog began to roll in, that comfort began to fade. By the time we reached the horseshoe curve, the air had grown heavy, almost oppressive. The locomotive's headlamp barely pierced the dense mist, and every shadow seemed to shift and stretch unnaturally. Henry, who had been chatty at the start of the trip, had grown quiet, his gaze fixed on the tracks ahead. "Do you feel that?" he asked suddenly, his voice barely audible over the engine's rumble. "Feel what?" I replied, though I already knew what he meant. "The air. Just cold, wrong?" I didn't answer. My focus was on the tracks, on the faint glimmer of something ahead. It wasn't a light. No, it was darker than the surrounding fog, a shape moving in the distance. And then I heard it. The whistle. Low and mournful, it cut through the silence like a blade, sending a shiver down my spine. Henry stiffened beside me. "What the hell was that?" I didn't answer. My hands tightened on the controls and I slowed the train, my instincts screaming at me to stop. But as we rounded the curve, I saw it. The faint outline of another train on the parallel track. It wasn't possible. No other train was scheduled for this route tonight. The locomotive was massive, its shape barely discernible through the fog. It moved with an unnatural grace, its wheels silent as they turned. And then as it passed, I saw them, the passengers. They stared out from the windows, their faces pale and emotionless, their eyes hollow and black. Just as Tom had described, they seemed to look right at me, through me, their gazes filled with a terrible emptiness. Henry let out a choked gasp, stumbling back. What is that?" "It's them," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "The Phantom train." The ghostly locomotive passed us, its shadowy cars stretching into the mist, and just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The air grew still again, the fog seeming to dissipate slightly. But the damage was done. Henry turned to me, his face pale, his hands trembling. "You knew about this, didn't you? You've seen it before." I didn't deny it. "I tried to warn you. But no one can truly prepare for it." He stared at me for a long moment before looking away, his shoulders slumping. "Why us? Why did it show itself to us?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the train had marked me, and now it seemed to have marked Henry as well. As we continued our journey to Pittsburgh, a heavy silence settled between us. The whistle didn't sound again that night, but I knew this wasn't the end. The Phantom train wasn't just a ghost. It was something worse, something that tied itself to the living, dragging them into its endless, mournful journey. And I was on its list. I couldn't bring myself to talk to Henry for the rest of the trip to Pittsburgh. He sat across from me, staring blankly at the floor of the cab, his face pale and drawn. Whatever youthful energy he had brought with him to this job seemed to have been drained in an instant. We completed the freight run without incident, but the silence between us was suffocating. By the time we reached the Pittsburgh yard and shut down the locomotive, it was clear that Henry was done talking. Not just for the night, but maybe for good. "I'm putting in for a transfer," he muttered as we disembarked. "What?" I asked, startled. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice trembling. "Whatever that was out there, it wasn't natural. And I don't want to be around when it comes back." I wanted to argue, to tell him that leaving wouldn't make a difference, that the phantom train would follow him no matter where he went. But who was I to crush the last shred of hope he had? "Be careful, Henry," I said instead. He didn't reply. He just walked away, his head bowed, disappearing into the shadows of the yard. A new shadow. In the days that followed, I felt the weight of the phantom train pressing down on me more than ever. Everywhere I went, I felt its presence, an oppressive, invisible force that seemed to linger in the air, in the dark corners of the station, in the distant hum of the tracks. And I wasn't alone. The other engineers, the firemen, even the station workers. Everyone seemed to be on edge, their conversations hushed and their eyes darting nervously around as if they too were being watched. One night, as I sat alone in the station house, sifting through old logs and records, Tom Richards approached me again. His face was grim and his usual easy demeanor was gone. "You're not sleeping, are you?" he asked, pulling up a chair. I shook my head. "Not much. It feels like it's always there waiting." Tom nodded slowly, his expression dark. "That's how it starts. The more you think about it, the stronger its hold gets. It feeds on your fear, your doubt. The trick is to not let it consume you." "Easier said than done," I muttered. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There's something you should know, Johnny. Something I haven't told anyone else. I've seen the phantom train more times than I can count, but I've never been able to figure out what it wants. Some say it's a warning. Others think it's a punishment. But the one thing I know for sure is that it's not just a ghost. It's something worse." "What do you mean, worse?" Tom hesitated, his eyes darting toward the door as if he expected someone, or something, to be listening. "It's a doorway. A bridge between this world and whatever's on the other side. And once it has you in its sights, it won't stop until it pulls you across." The room seemed to grow colder at his words, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. "How do you fight something like that?" I asked. "You don't," Tom said simply. "You run. And you hope it doesn't catch you." The call to tunnel number 2. A week later, I was called to take another run through the mountains, a route that would once again take me through tunnel number 2. My stomach churned as I read the orders, the memory of my last encounter with the phantom train still fresh in my mind. I considered refusing the job, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. If Tom was right, the phantom train would find me no matter where I went. At least this way I could face it on my terms. As I climbed into the cab that evening, the air felt heavy with anticipation. My fireman for the night was a quiet, older man named Bill Turner. He didn't ask questions and I didn't volunteer any answers. The journey began uneventfully, the locomotive chugging steadily along the tracks as the sun dipped below the horizon. But as we approached tunnel number 2, the familiar unease began to creep in. The fog was thicker here, clinging to the ground like a living thing, and the air grew colder with every mile. When the tunnel came into view, I slowed the train, my hands trembling on the controls. The mouth of the tunnel loomed ahead, a black void that seemed to swallow the light from our headlamp. Bill glanced at me, his brow furrowed. "You all right, Johnny?" I nodded, though my heart was pounding in my chest. "Yeah, just keep an eye out." We entered the tunnel, the darkness closing in around us like a shroud. The sound of the engine echoed off the walls, a deafening roar that seemed to amplify the silence beyond. And then, just as we neared the exit, it happened. The train lurched violently, the brakes screeching as if some unseen force had grabbed hold of the cars. Bill shouted something, but his voice was drowned out by the cacophony of grinding metal. And then I saw it. The phantom train was there, waiting for us at the tunnel's exit. Its form was more distinct now, its dark, shadowy shape illuminated by the faint glow of its spectral lights. And standing on the track ahead was the figure, the same distorted, inhuman shape I had seen before. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment time seemed to stop. The air grew impossibly cold, and I felt a pull, a force dragging me toward the figure, toward the train. I fought against it, gripping the controls with all my strength, but it was as if the very air around me was alive, working against me. "Johnny, what's happening?" Bill shouted, his voice panicked. I didn't answer. I couldn't. All I could do was stare into those hollow eyes, knowing that this was just the beginning. I couldn't move. My hands gripped the controls of the locomotive so tightly my knuckles turned white, but it was no use. The force pulling me toward the phantom train was stronger than anything I'd ever felt, an invisible tether binding me to it. Bill shouted something behind me, but his voice seemed distant, muffled, as if we were separated by a thick wall of water. My entire focus was on the figure standing in front of the spectral train, its hollow eyes piercing through me, pulling me into their endless void. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the pull stopped. The engine lurched forward, breaking free from whatever force had held it, and the phantom train vanished into the fog. One moment it was there, its dark, otherworldly shape towering over the tracks, and the next it was gone, leaving only silence in its wake. The sudden quiet was almost deafening. I released the controls and slumped back into my seat, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. "What the hell just happened?" Bill demanded, his voice shaking. I didn't know how to answer. What could I say? That we had just encountered a ghost train? That we had been pulled to the brink of something far worse? "I don't know," I finally muttered. "Let's just get out of here." The haunted shadows of Galitzin. We completed the run in silence, neither of us daring to speak about what we had seen. But the experience had shaken me to my core. For the rest of the night, I couldn't stop thinking about the phantom train, about the figure standing in its path. What was it? Why had it shown itself to me again? And more importantly, what did it want? I needed answers. The next day, I took a trip to Galitzin, a small town near Tunnel Number 2. It was a quiet, unassuming place, but it had a dark history tied to the railroad. Many of the townsfolk were descendants of the workers who had built the tunnels and tracks through the mountains, and the stories of accidents and tragedies had been passed down through generations. I sought out an old-timer named Samuel Wainwright, a retired railroad worker who was known for his knowledge of the area's history. When I mentioned the phantom train, his expression darkened, and he gestured for me to follow him to a back room of his small, cluttered house. "I was hoping I'd never have to talk about this again," he said, pouring us each a glass of whiskey. "But if you've seen it, then you deserve to know the truth." He pulled out an old leather-bound journal and set it on the table between us. The pages were filled with faded writing, diagrams of train engines, and sketches of tunnels. "This belonged to my grandfather," Samuel explained. "He worked on the Altoona line back when the first sighting started. He called it the Train of Shadows, said it wasn't just a ghost but something much worse, a harbinger of death." I leaned forward, my heart pounding as he opened the journal to a page with a detailed sketch of the phantom train. The likeness was uncanny, right down to the shadowy figures staring out from its windows. "He believed it was tied to the land," Samuel continued. "Said the train only appears where the veil between this world and the next is thin. Places like Tunnel Number 2, the Horseshoe Curve, places where a lot of blood has been spilled." I nodded, remembering the stories I had read about the derailments and accidents on the line. "But why does it appear to some people and not others?" Samuel hesitated, his fingers tracing the edge of the journal. "Because it's choosing them, marking them. My grandfather believed that the phantom train doesn't just haunt the tracks, it collects souls. The people who see it are the ones it's trying to claim." The room seemed to grow colder at his words, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Is there any way to stop it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Samuel shook his head. "Once it's marked you, there's no escape. You can try to outrun it, but it always finds you in the end. The only thing you can do is face it, and hope that it decides to let you go." The return to Tunnel Number 2. I left Galitzin with more questions than answers. If Samuel was right, then the phantom train wasn't just a ghostly apparition, it was something far more dangerous, something that had marked me for reasons I couldn't understand. But I couldn't live in fear forever. If the train was going to come for me, then I had to be ready. A week later, I received another assignment to take a freight run through tunnel number 2. This time I didn't hesitate. I accepted the job and prepared myself for whatever lay ahead. As I climbed into the cab that night, the air was heavy with anticipation. I could feel the phantom train's presence before I even left the station, a faint, suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. The journey to the tunnel was uneventful, but the tension grew with every mile. By the time the black mouth of tunnel number 2 came into view, my hands were trembling on the controls. "Here we go," I muttered under my breath. As we entered the tunnel, the air grew cold, and the darkness seemed to swallow the engine's headlamp. The sound of the locomotive echoed off the walls, a haunting reminder of how alone we were. And then, just as we neared the exit, it appeared. The phantom train was waiting for me. It stood at the exit of tunnel number 2, its dark, hulking form obscured by mist, yet utterly inescapable. The phantom train's headlamp flickered with an unnatural glow, illuminating nothing but the spectral outline of its engine and the cars that followed. Its whistle screamed through the tunnel, a long, mournful wail that sent shivers down my spine. I slowed the engine to a crawl, my mind racing. The phantom train wasn't just waiting, it was blocking the exit. My instincts screamed to reverse, to retreat back into the darkness of the tunnel, but something deep inside stopped me. It wanted me to run. It wanted me to show fear. Bill, my fireman for the night, was frozen in place, his hands clutching the edge of the seat. "Johnny, what's the plan?" I took a deep breath, forcing myself to steady my trembling hands. "We're not running," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "What? Are you out of your mind?" "Maybe," I admitted, gripping the throttle. "But I think that's what it wants. And I'm tired of letting it win." I pressed the whistle, letting out a long, defiant blast. The sound echoed through the tunnel, a sharp contrast to the mournful wail of the phantom train. For a moment, there was silence, as if the specter was caught off guard by my audacity. And then it answered. Its whistle screamed through the air, louder and more piercing than before. The tunnel seemed to tremble around us, the sound reverberating off the walls in a cacophony of despair. "Johnny, we have to back up," Bill pleaded. "This isn't something we can fight." I ignored him, my focus locked on the dark shape ahead. My hand tightened on the throttle and I pushed it forward. The engine roared, the wheels grinding against the rails as we began to move toward the phantom train. The ghostly locomotive didn't move. It stood its ground, its headlamp flickering as if taunting us. The closer we got, the more the air around us seemed to thicken, growing colder and heavier with each passing second. And then I saw them. The figures in the phantom train's windows. Dozens of shadowy forms stared out at us, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Their faces were pale and gaunt, their expressions blank. But as we drew closer, something changed. Their faces twisted into grotesque shapes, smiling, sneering, mocking. They pressed their hands against the glass, their mouths moving in silent screams. I felt a wave of dread wash over me, but I didn't stop. The engine pushed forward, the light from our headlamp cutting through the fog like a blade. The phantom train's whistle blared again, louder and angrier this time. The spectral locomotive began to move, its dark form sliding toward us with an unnatural grace. The gap between us closed rapidly, and for a moment I thought we were about to collide. But just as the two trains were about to meet, the phantom train vanished. It didn't fade or dissipate, it simply disappeared, leaving nothing behind but a rush of cold air and the faint echo of its whistle. Bill let out a shaky breath, slumping back in his seat. What just happened?" I didn't have an answer. My hands were still gripping the controls, my knuckles white. I released the throttle and slowed the train to a stop, my heart pounding in my chest. The tunnel was silent now, the oppressive weight of the phantom train gone. But I knew this wasn't the end. The phantom train hadn't left. It had retreated, for now. The aftermath. We completed the run without further incident, but the encounter left a mark on both of us. Bill refused to speak about what had happened, and I didn't push him. I knew the weight of the experience would stay with him, just as it had stayed with me. When we reached the yard, I reported the encounter to my supervisor. He listened quietly, his expression unreadable, and then dismissed me with a terse nod. "Get some rest, Hargrove," he said. "You've had a rough night." But rest was impossible. That night, as I lay in bed, the sound of the phantom train's whistle echoed in my ears, haunting me in the silence. I dreamed of shadowy figures staring out from the windows, their hollow eyes following me wherever I went. And when I woke, I felt it again, that heavy, suffocating presence, lingering just beyond the edge of perception. The phantom train wasn't done with me. I woke up in a cold sweat, the sound of the phantom train's whistle still ringing in my ears. The encounter at tunnel number 2 had shaken me to my core, but it had also confirmed something I had been too afraid to admit. The phantom train wasn't just haunting the tracks, it was haunting me. The days that followed were a blur. Every time I stepped onto the platform, I felt its presence, an invisible weight pressing down on me. Every time I climbed into a cab, I half expected to see it waiting for me in the distance. I tried to focus on my work, to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. The phantom train had marked me, and it wouldn't stop until it claimed me. A visit from Tom Richards. One evening, as I sat in the station house, poring over route maps and schedules, Tom Richards appeared at my table. He looked tired, his face lined with worry, but there was a determination in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. "Johnny," he said, pulling up a chair. "We need to talk." I nodded, motioning for him to sit. "I figured you'd come around sooner or later." Tom leaned forward, his voice low. "Word's gotten around about what happened at tunnel number 2. The other engineers are spooked. They're saying the phantom train's getting bolder." "They're not wrong," I said, my voice heavy. "It's not just an apparition, Tom. Something more. Something alive." Tom nodded slowly. "I've been doing some digging. Talking to old-timers, looking through records. There's a pattern, Johnny. Every time the phantom train shows up, someone disappears." The room seemed to grow colder at his words, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Disappears?" "Engineers, firemen, station workers, even passengers," Tom said. "They're here one day and the next they're gone. No explanation, no trace. And every one of them reported seeing the phantom train before they vanished." The implications were clear. The phantom train wasn't just haunting the tracks, it was taking people. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Tom's expression darkened. "Because I think you're next." The legend of the last run. Tom wasn't the only one who believed the phantom train was more than just a ghost. Over the next few days, I spoke to other railroad workers, piecing together fragments of stories and legends. The most chilling of them was the tale of the last run. According to the legend, the phantom train appears to those it has marked for one final journey, a journey from which they never return. The chosen engineer is lured onto the tracks, their locomotive mysteriously drawn into the spectral train's path. And then they vanish. Some say the phantom train drags its victims into another realm, a place where time and space don't exist. Others believe it's a punishment, a way of claiming the souls of those who died unjustly on the railroad. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. No one who boarded the phantom train ever came back. The final assignment. A week later, I received an unexpected assignment, a late-night freight run from Altoona to Pittsburgh. It was a route I had taken many times before, but this time, something felt different. The instructions were vague, the schedule rushed. The dispatcher handed me the orders without meeting my eyes, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something I didn't. As I climbed into the cab that night, the air was heavy with anticipation. My fireman for the run was a young man named Charlie, eager and full of energy, a stark contrast to my own unease. "Ready to roll, Mr. Hargrove?" he asked, his smile bright. I forced a nod. "Yeah, let's get moving." The journey began uneventfully, the locomotive chugging steadily along the tracks. But as we approached the mountains, the familiar unease began to creep in. The fog was thicker here, clinging to the ground like a living thing, and the air grew colder with every mile. By the time we reached the outskirts of Gallitzin, I knew we were being watched. The return to tunnel number 2. The black mouth of tunnel number 2 loomed ahead, its jagged edges illuminated by the faint glow of the engine's headlamp. My hands tightened on the controls as we approached, the memory of my last encounter with the phantom train fresh in my mind. "Everything okay, Mr. Hargrove?" Charlie asked, sensing my tension. "Just keep your eyes open," I said. As we entered the tunnel, the darkness swallowed us whole. The sound of the engine echoed off the walls, a haunting reminder of how alone we were. And then, just as we neared the exit, the air grew impossibly cold. The phantom train was waiting. This time it didn't appear gradually. It was simply there, its shadowy form towering over the tracks, its spectral headlamp casting an eerie glow through the fog. I brought the locomotive to a halt, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure was there too, standing on the tracks in front of the phantom train. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and I felt the now familiar pull, the invisible force dragging me toward it. Charlie let out a startled cry, scrambling back in his seat. "What the hell is that?" "It's the phantom train," I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "What do we do?" I didn't answer. There was nothing we could do. The phantom train's whistle blared, a deafening scream that seemed to shake the very foundation of the tunnel. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as if it were savoring the moment. And then the light from the phantom train's headlamp began to grow, spreading through the tunnel like a wave of fire. The light from the phantom train's headlamp consumed the tunnel, bathing everything in an eerie glow that seemed to strip away reality itself. The sound of its whistle was deafening, a bone-chilling wail that resonated deep within me. Charlie was shouting, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. "We've got to get out of here. We can't just sit here." But there was nowhere to go. Reversing wasn't an option. Something told me the phantom train would follow, its presence inescapable. And charging forward would mean certain doom. The figure stepped closer, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. The pull intensified, stronger than ever, and I felt as though my very soul was being drawn from my body. "No," I whispered, gripping the controls. "Not like this. I wasn't going to let the phantom train take me without a fight. If it wanted me, it would have to earn it." The collision course. With a surge of adrenaline, I pushed the throttle forward. The engine roared to life, the wheels grinding against the rails as we began to move toward the phantom train. "What are you doing?" Charlie screamed. "Hold on," I shouted back. The phantom train didn't flinch. Its shadowy form loomed ahead, growing larger with each passing second. The figure on the tracks didn't move, its gaze unwavering. As we barreled toward it, I sounded the whistle, a long, defiant blast that cut through the tunnel like a blade. The phantom train responded with a shriek that made my blood run cold. And then we collided. The other side. The moment our engine touched the phantom train, the world exploded into chaos. The light from its headlamp engulfed us, blinding and searing, and the sound of the collision was deafening. For a moment, I felt weightless, as though we had been lifted from the tracks and thrown into the void. When the light faded, we were no longer in the tunnel. The locomotive was still moving, but the scenery around us had changed. The mountains, trees, and tracks were gone, replaced by an endless expanse of gray mist. The air was cold and still, and the only sound was the steady chugging of the engine. Charlie was slumped in his seat, unconscious but breathing. I reached over and shook him awake. "Charlie, wake up." His eyes fluttered open and he looked around in confusion. Where are we?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. Ahead, the phantom train loomed, its spectral form gliding through the mist like a predator stalking its prey. The figures in its windows were clearer now, their faces pressed against the glass. Their eyes were hollow, but there was a strange, almost pleading look in them, as if they were begging for release. The figure from the tracks appeared again, standing atop the phantom train's engine. It raised a hand, beckoning us forward. The confrontation. I brought the locomotive to a stop, my heart pounding as I climbed out of the cab. The mist swirled around me, cold and oppressive, but I forced myself to move forward. "What are you doing?" Charlie called after me. "I have to end this," I said. The figure watched silently as I approached, its hollow eyes following my every move. When I was just a few feet away, it raised its hand again, pointing toward the phantom train. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't respond, but the faces in the train's windows began to move, their mouths forming silent words. I couldn't hear them, but I could feel their message in my mind. "Help us." "Help you?" I whispered. The figure nodded, its skeletal hand gesturing toward the phantom train. I stepped closer, my fear replaced by a strange sense of determination. As I touched the side of the phantom train, a wave of energy surged through me, and the world around me dissolved into darkness. The truth revealed. In the darkness, I saw visions, flashes of the past, of the lives lost on the railroad. Accidents, derailments, tragedies that had claimed countless souls. The phantom train was not a malevolent force, but a prison, a vessel carrying the spirits of those who had died unjustly. The figure was their guardian, their warden, tasked with collecting the souls and keeping them bound to the train. But something had gone wrong. The train had become corrupted, its purpose twisted into something darker. I realized then why it had marked me. I wasn't its next victim, I was its key. The visions faded, and I found myself back on the tracks, standing in front of the phantom train. The figure was gone, and the faces in the windows were calm, their expressions peaceful. The train let out one final whistle, a mournful sound that echoed through the mist. And then it vanished. The return. When I woke, I was back in the cab of my locomotive. Charlie was shaking me, his face pale. "Johnny, are you okay?" I blinked, disoriented. The tunnel's exit was just ahead, the familiar landscape of the Altoona line visible beyond. The phantom train was gone, and the air was warm and still. "We're back," I said, my voice hoarse. Charlie looked at me like I was crazy, but he didn't press for answers. We completed the run in silence, both of us too shaken to speak. I never saw the phantom train again, but its presence stayed with me. I left the railroad a few months later, unable to shake the memories of that night. To this day, I don't know why the phantom train chose me, or how I was able to free its passengers. But I like to believe that, in some small way, I gave them peace. The railroad still whispers of the phantom train, and those who travel the Altoona line speak of cold spots and distant whistles in the night. Perhaps it's still out there, waiting for someone else to hear its call.